treatments for patients who need it. I want to go over to Nicholas because on the conversation we had about a week ago, he was really talking about this concept of validation. And I wonder if you just talk a little bit about how we can get to where we're at right now, utilizing some of the tools that these two identified to get to that place of validation.
Absolutely, and I would echo many of the sentiments and viewpoints that were shared by both of you. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to say a few things to be intentionally provocative, and the reason for that is primarily because we're looking at a brand new industry. We're looking at a new opportunity that can literally impact the lives of millions of people. And so, please take what I say with a grain of salt, but I actually would make the argument that the biggest impediment to real research is the inability to properly differentiate between the medical initiatives and the recreational initiatives. And because that has not been made, institutions are unwilling to take risk. And you have institutions that have risk all over the country. We are partnered with several academic medical centers, even in New York State. We're partnered with agricultural land-grant universities that rely on federal subsidies that want to participate in this. What they encounter is not a federal obstacle. Not to say that they don't exist, but what they encounter are internal opposition from compliance groups because of the downside risk. And I think that the most unfortunate thing that we've seen is no one ever stands up and says, we don't think this has medical benefit. They stand up in crowds and communities and they say, we don't want this to turn into something that has a number of unintended consequences. And so the way we have approached it, and we fundamentally believe that this plant has medical value. We also believe that the FDA process, the type of process that the FDA enforces and provides and structure, is very important for the medical community to really understand how to use a product like this in a medical setting. But where we run into the obstacle, and where we have the freedom because we're not going through an FDA process, is we also believe in the entourage effect. And I know you had mentioned this as well, but it's so hard to create a product and an environment where you need to manufacture the flexibility to utilize all of the different components of the plant properly to really understand how they impact patients in different patient categories, because there's so much subjectivity to each qualifying condition that we're familiar with. And when I think about, you know, the way people try to actually mimic the entourage effect, it's really by falling back onto the argument that leaf is the only solution. The problem with leaf in our experience is that you can only get a 75% level range of consistency batch over batch, no matter how strict your environmental controls are. So what we have turned to is a much more pharmaceutical type of manufacturing process where we fractionate, we formulate, we process. We do all these things with the natural extract, but then we bear down into individual CBD categories, because who knows how each type of CBD impacts intractable epilepsy? We don't. And we should, but we don't. We wish we did. But if you're talking to a member of the medical community, having that level of sophistication is invaluable. And being able to describe something simple like, you know, a stability test, or, you know, the pharmacokinetic impact of different methods of delivery for different types of illnesses. These are things that GW is dealing with all the time. Some of the industry players, ourselves included, are trying to mimic that sophistication and that process where we believe that they have shown to use best practices. Where we differ is only based on the fact that we can, because it is a Schedule 1 substance, so the FDA doesn't have overview. And the second thing I would say is, just out of curiosity, how many people in this room think that this should be rescheduled from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 2 product? Raise your hands. That's amazing. Okay, so what it means is it means that you're taking the product from a very limited access where it has quote unquote no medical value in the eyes of the DEA, and you would basically be putting it into a category where the FDA would have oversight. We are not, even though it would probably be in our best interest, we are not advocates at this point for a rescheduling of cannabis. And it's not because we don't believe it has medical value, it's because the only way we think that we can actually get long-term sustainable support from all the stakeholders that are still questioning how these products are manufactured is if we let the process take its time. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, and I frankly, we've gone through several IRB processes and failed. It's just, we're trying to think about this. If it's taken 40 years for the industry to get to this point and people to realize that this really does have medical value, how do we take the next 10 years or the next 5 years? It may take that long, and I know people are working on it, but that's one of the things that we're trying to wrestle with, and we wrestle with every day, because we need all of the stakeholders, especially the ones that don't agree with what we're doing, to support what we're doing and how we're doing it. And so it's a complicated issue, but ultimately, product development is at the core of what everybody should be focused on in the industry. And unless we can, back to my initial point, unless we can separate the difference and really make that distinction between medical and recreational, it's going to be hard for anyone to get across that finish line.
It's great. Would really, really love to jump in and spend some time on that. I did want to go to Rose, though, because Rose has been really involved in creating a lot of the products that are being used in the medical marijuana space. And I think what one of your goals is, and what everyone's talking about, is getting better performance out of these drugs and getting fewer of the negative side effects, like that you get from pesticides or metals or other things that you've been working on. Can you talk a little bit about the products that you've been making?
Absolutely. Where I come from in the industry is the supply side of what you guys are trying to do, or in an herbal therapy or arena. I guess when you were talking about rescheduling to Schedule 2, I think a lot of us would say we would rather deschedule. I'd rather look at cannabis as an herbal therapy than as a pharmaceutical agent, and I think that the regulations that apply to those two completely separate industries are very different. And I think the low toxicity of cannabis would lend itself more as an herbal therapy, and the regulations, FDA regulations that support that industry more than it does. I mean, it also has pharmaceutical, obviously, impact. But as is coming from a supply side, and having worked in the nutraceutical industry briefly also, there is a lack of institutional support for the cannabis industry that other nutraceutical industries have. And when they're trying to meet FDA regulations for heavy metals testing, or pesticide residue, or solvent residue, or micro contamination, or stability studies in their products, they don't have outside laboratories that they can contract with to do that. In the nutraceutical industry, if you want to test your herbal extract, you send it to Eurofins or another lab that just does metals testing, and they do millions and millions of metals tests for all kinds of industries across the country all day long. But they're not going to touch a cannabis product because they have a whole other business that's perfectly supported, and they don't need to jeopardize their entire company to do that sort of safety testing for your industry. And also with pesticide residue testing, or solvent residue testing, or stability studies, which are all services that the nutraceutical industry or the pharmaceutical industry actually routinely outsource to other companies that specialize in those tests. So we in the cannabis industry don't have a validated, promulgated method that everyone uses to analyze for cannabinoid content. We don't have a promulgated method that's used to test for pesticides. And some of the chemical companies are starting, like ArtSexTherapy, are doing research and providing some background information to help the cannabis analytical labs do that sort of testing properly. But it's just up and coming. And in order to produce these regular, precisely dosed, safe products for medical testing, for observational studies, we need to have that institutional support to produce that level of product. We're capable of producing that level of product, but we don't have. It's much more expensive and much more complicated for us because we don't have any institutional support. Additionally, we're regulated by the state, so we have to do all of our services within the state lines of a single state in order to, we have to find our patients inside that state, we have to grow the cannabis inside that state, we have to test it inside that state, we have to create products inside that state with no outside, because that's interstate drug trafficking. once you cross over into that, which is not something that somebody's making guarana pills has to really worry about.